In the last few centuries before the Common Era, Judaism underwent radical changes. The lands of Israel and Judah had come under the influence by the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Macedonians, and Seleucids. As these cultures arrived and were replaced, their influence remained. Among the many details that changed were those of their chief deity. Yahweh began as a god of war and thunder, personally attending battles to hurl stones and lightning at his enemies, and sitting down for meals with his chosen representatives. But gradually he became less attached to the intimate workings of the world. He existed as part of the natural order, but wasn't always present within it. He moved behind the scenes, punishing the wicked and rewarding the righteous, but this wasn't his final form either. Eventually, he would become so far removed from the world that he could only be contacted by the high priest, and even his name would become secret. He was invisible and inscrutable, yet even that wouldn't be the end. Because once a national god becomes so far removed as to seemingly cease to exist, it gives rise to a personal longing to reestablish that lost connection. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the previous episode, we covered the 3 cycles of speeches, a collection of monologues between Job and his 3 opponents, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. In each, his opponents suggested that Job's current condition, being abandoned by his family, suffering some unknown skin condition, and severe depression, were all caused by some offense he had given toward God. They repeatedly referenced wisdom literature, such as Proverbs, to explain to the man that only the wicked suffer so greatly. Job is suffering, therefore he must be guilty of something. And as the wisdom literature suggests, if he returns to God, he'll be rewarded. But these arguments aren't satisfying to Job, as he claims to have never turned his back on God. He demonstrates that he not only has a keen grasp on wisdom, better even than his opponents, but among the group only he can speak directly to God. So what's the problem? Why is he suffering this unjust punishment? The answer is a drastic shift in Israelite theology, and we'll see that explanation soon. While God was once a limited being, grounded by the emotions and whims of humanity, behaving much the same way as a powerful ruler, a divine king, he's no longer confined in that manner. As we'll soon see, the God of the Old Testament has evolved. Let's get started. The initial story of Job has 2 more sections that weren't covered in the last episode. They are Job's summary or final argument in chapters 29 to 31, and Yahweh's conversation with Job, which begins in chapter 38 and concludes with chapter 42, verse 6. Job takes up his case, once again using court language, and tells us he longs for the days when God still illuminated his path as he walked through the darkness of life. His children stayed by his side when God remained with him, and princes heeded Job's words. In this tale, Job wasn't a mere farmer, but some advisor or dignitary, or perhaps a priest. He was highly regarded and widely respected. He wore justice like a robe and rescued orphans, widows, and the poor. He thought to grow old and multiply in years like the phoenix, a clear example that Hebrew authors were familiar with Greek mythology. In chapter 30, Job contrasts his current life with that of his previous state, which he outlined in chapter 29. When he understood the rules, his life was better. He was rewarded for doing the right thing, and the wicked were punished for their sins. Things are different now. Those who once listened to his wise counsel now hold him in derision. He is mocked for his misfortune, and the lowly now sit high above him. He aches from injuries that God has inflicted, and the pain prevents him from a peaceful night's sleep, and he feels like he's being tossed by a tempest. He reminds the reader how he wept for those less fortunate than himself, but now no one weeps for him. He receives evil instead of good, darkness instead of light. Now he is left alone, his blackened skin falling from his body. Job concludes his case in chapter 31 by rhetorically asking, "What is the heritage of the Almighty? Isn't it supposed to be calamity for the unrighteous? Can't God see Job's ways?" He then challenges God to weigh him in the scales of justice so that God will know that Job is innocent. He makes numerous statements in support of his own integrity, which parallel Egyptian mortuary texts where the deceased declare their virtues before Osiris, along with a list of sins they're not guilty of. The point Job is making is that he has not done these things, yet he has been punished as if he had. So he calls for those punishments if he is found guilty of those offenses. If he has coveted his neighbor's wife, let his wife seek another husband. If he has neglected the poor or rejoiced in wealth, then punish him for that. If he has failed to offer a hand of friendship to an orphan, he challenges God to chop off his arm. He even declares that, unlike other Jews, he never worshiped the sun or the moon, nor did he rejoice in the suffering of his enemies, as others have rejoiced in his own suffering. He even claims that his family can testify to his generosity and hospitality. He never allowed a stranger to sleep in the streets because he sheltered them. This refutes the earlier claims of his opponents who accuse him of neglecting the poor. What's interesting here is that, of the 14 sins Job mentions, the only cultic sin is the worship of the sun and moon. The rest of the sins all involve charitable action, social crimes, and ethical issues such as a lack of pity for the homeless, lust, unfair treatment of slaves, lying, and concealing his sins. Truly heinous crimes such as murder aren't even considered, so Job isn't even being accused of any serious offense. The suggestion is quite clear. He may not be perfect, but he certainly isn't deserving of his poor treatment. Something interesting occurs at the end of chapter 31. Job wishes he had some intermediary who could hear his case when he stands before God, so that he could receive justice. He then cries, "Here is my signature." He demands his accuser write out his indictment so he can present himself before his judge like a prince, not a criminal, and will accept his punishment if the land cries out against him. This is another of those curious passages that I'll ask you to recall. I'll explain the possible significance a bit later. After all of this, 3 rounds of monologues between the 4 characters, and a final challenge from Job, we reach the final scene in the original story of Job when the man himself steps on stage. Yahweh appears to Job in a storm. Yes, another storm god reference at the beginning of chapter 38. Yahweh then begins asking Job a series of rhetorical questions because that's what the book of Job is all about. His questions are mostly concerned with his own might and the creation of the world. Yahweh asks things like, "Where were you when I founded the earth? Who determined its size? Into what were its pillars sunk? Who laid its cornerstone?" Things like that. This gives us a version of the creation story not found in the Genesis 1 or 2 accounts. In the first chapter, God divides the waters to allow dry land to emerge, and in the second chapter, he adds water to dry land. But here, God is more of a carpenter, measuring the area where the world shall be constructed, installing foundation pillars, placing the cornerstone, and so on. We're told that this occurred while the morning stars ranged together and all the sons of God shouted with joy. This is clearly not the 6-day creation account, which has dry land and the seas established on the 3rd day, but the sun, moon, and stars aren't created until the 4th day. Here in Job 38, we see a reference to a different creation story where the stars predate the construction of the earth, and these lights in the heavens are other gods. A great chorus of these celestial beings are singing in celebration at the creation of the world. God then shuts away the sea behind doors because the sea had burst from the womb. Recall in the last episode when Job compared the primordial chaotic ocean to existence in the womb, dark and lacking life. Here we see it again. To them, the primordial ocean, which had been defeated to allow an orderly creation, is likened to a womb. God then commands the sea to obey its boundaries, a spoken command to not encroach on land. He also asks Job if he has commanded the morning and instructed the sun on where to rise. He also threatens to take hold of the corners of the world and shake the wicked loose. God has walked the width of the world, even to the bottom of the sea. Truly, he knows the expanse of his creation. God also asks Job if he knows where the lights dwell. This is a reference to the idea that the sun and moon hide when they're not visible in the sky. See episode 52 for more information on their cosmology. Speaking of that episode, God then asks if Job has entered the storehouses where the snow and hail are kept, and asks who has set the path that thunderstorms follow. Yahweh then claims to be the father of the rain, another storm god reference, but ice comes not from him, but from a womb. So we have a possible reference to a nature goddess. We're told the waters are covered by a capstone that hold the deep captive, a reference to the idea that the Jerusalem temple is the capstone that plugs up the fountain which threatens to flood the world, which is why the annual atonement sacrifice must be kept. Failure to do so would result in the destruction of the world as in the days of Noah. See episode 36. Speaking of atonement and the temple, we're then told that God bound the stars of the Pleiades together. To learn the significance of that particular detail in relation to the atonement sacrifice and the Jerusalem temple, see episode 52. And speaking of constellations, God then asks if Job can guide the bear with her children. A clear reference to the she-bears, which represent the Ursa constellations and 42 children, which they mauled in the Elisha story. See episode 63. Finally, God asks Job if he knows the plans of heaven and can enact their effects on the earth. This is a reference to the idea that the events of earth are a sort of replay of events that occur in heaven. For more information on the idea that the earth is supposed to be a mirror image of the heavens, refer to episode 35. I promise I'm not doing this on purpose. In chapter 38, God is just clearly expressing his opinion that all of you should listen to more episodes of my podcast. In chapter 39, Yahweh lays off the Dragons in Genesis episodes and hits us with some nature trivia. He asks Job if he knows when the mountain goats are born, or who gave wild donkeys their freedom. He tells Job that ostriches forget their eggs lying on the ground because God has withheld the wisdom from those stupid birds. They believed that a bird should lay their eggs in a tree like a proper bird, but ostriches are too dumb for that business. I guess they like to have ostriches falling out of trees and onto unsuspecting travelers, which would not be fun. They also believed that they're abandoning their nests when they walk away, which means whoever wrote this never tried to approach one of those nests. If so, he would have been murdered to death, as ostriches do. But the point here is that ostriches do things that humans would see as immoral, such as leaving their young alone. Yet for the ostrich, this is the correct thing to do, and humans can't comprehend why. But God knows. The ways of God, and the ostrich, are beyond human understanding. And speaking of bird knowledge, we're told at the end of the chapter that hawks soar high looking for food, and then their young drink blood. I think the author is confusing hawks with Louisiana mosquitoes, since they're roughly the same size. Also, hawks don't drink blood, except the dreaded vampire hawks of Transylvania, of course. In chapter 40, God asks if Job wishes to respond, but the man admits his insignificance and can't give an answer. Then God hits him with some more tough love, telling Job to put on his big boy pants and quit behaving like a child. He asks if Job would condemn God in order to be justified. Basically, Job is in the right, but does he really want to set that kind of precedent? Does Job actually want to condemn God in order to be recognized as being innocent? We then go back to the primordial days when God tells Job to look at Behemoth, whom he compares to a grass-eating ox, and says that he made Behemoth. This is an example of the great primordial beasts being demoted to the state of merely created animals. We saw this in the Eden story with the serpent god Nehushtan. Instead of a sibling of Yahweh, he's reduced to the status of an animal. Behemoth lies in the shade of the trees, and only Yahweh can approach him with a sword. Only Yahweh can capture him. He then starts in on Leviathan, asking if Job can put a hook into Leviathan and tie down the dragon's tongue with a rope. These scenes of battle with the primordial beast harken back to a time when the Israelites believed their universe had been created through combat, as the chaos monsters were killed by the young war god, thus paving the way for the gods to organize creation and build the world, and ultimately populate it with people. God continues speaking about the ferocity of Leviathan in chapter 41, claiming that the mere sight of the creature is enough to defeat the mightiest of men. The dragon is covered in tightly sealed armored scales, glowing eyes that shine like the dawn, and light and smoke that flashes from the nostrils. It breathes fire from its mouth. Even the other gods fear the mighty dragon. The depths boil because of the beast's motion, and it leaves white trails in the water. Descriptions such as these, the eye shine, powerful jaws, and armored scales, have led some to believe that Leviathan was inspired by crocodiles, while the smoke from its nostrils, immense size, and association with the sea have led others to speculate that it's inspired by whales. But the important thing to note here is that Yahweh is again depicted as a young war god who once fought a mighty water dragon that had threatened and terrorized the other gods, just as was the case with other Near Eastern storm gods such as Baal and Marduk. Finally, in the first 6 verses of chapter 42, Job responds to Yahweh's words by saying that no purpose of God can be thwarted, and he had spoken of things he didn't understand. Job admits the world is too wonderful for him to know, so he repents before God. Essentially, all of this is to illustrate that there is an order to creation far beyond the simple human understanding, and if Job can't understand the basics of creation, such as blood-guzzling hawks and flat earth foundation pillars, how could he possibly understand the complex reasoning and thought patterns of that world's creator? The universe is a mystery that humans cannot possibly comprehend, and its inner workings and God can't be judged by human standards. This is how the story of Job ends. He never learns why he's being punished. Not exactly. All he really learns is that he hadn't actually done anything wrong, so in a way, he's vindicated. His friends are wrong, and Job is technically right in that he was innocent all along. The purpose of his mistreatment had nothing at all to do with his behavior. The point of the story is that God does not punish the wicked and reward the righteous. God can't be reduced to such simple functions. God is inscrutable. His ways are beyond our understanding, and attempting to assign human motives to the creator of the universe is mere foolishness. It's not Job's reward or punishment that matters, but his relationship with God. And that God is right because he created everything and sees all. It's the ultimate appeal to authority, and Job submits to that authority. Verse 6 reads, "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." The curtains close and the lights come on. Job has been beaten into submission. God is unknowable, and his ways don't always make sense, and sometimes that sucks. But what can you do when faced with an omnipotent opponent? And that's how the story of Job concludes. But later redactors weren't satisfied with the collection of monologues, and various scribes throughout the decades or even centuries decided to modify the text with 3 distinct additions. The first is chapter 28, the Hymn to Wisdom. In the text, as we now have it, the Hymn to Wisdom is passed off as a continuation of chapter 27, one of Job's speeches, but it makes absolutely no sense coming from Job. Nor does it belong to any of his opponents, as it isn't written as a dispute. It's simply a poem or a hymn that was placed awkwardly into the book to emphasize the wisdom theme. The imagery used in this hymn is that of miners digging for riches. They dig for silver and gold, copper and iron, and open shafts into the darkness. Far from the lions and birds of prey, which are known for seeking out their quarry, yet even they can't find these mines, the miners discover precious stones and dig to the roots of the mountains. Hidden things are brought to the light, things no human would have ever discovered without countless hours of toil. But despite this deep searching in hidden places, they've only discovered earthly riches, and they're no closer to finding true wisdom. Wisdom, you see, she is more deeply hidden. The sea, and even the primordial depths, say, "She isn't with us, and she can't be purchased with gold or silver." And the value of wisdom isn't equaled by all the crystals and pearls. Abaddon and Mot claim to have only heard rumors of her. In case you're wondering, Abaddon is a Greek god of destruction, and Mot is the Canaanite god of death, and enemy of the god Baal-Hadad. Only God knows the path to her. Wisdom is inaccessible to humans. When God weighed out the winds and measured the waters and set rules for the rain and a path for lightning, he searched her out. So the creation of the universe by God was made through the power and wisdom of a female deity who predates the creation. Remember in the last episode when Eliphaz referenced Proverbs 8, where we learned that wisdom was the firstborn of creation, and through her the universe was made. So we have this idea appearing in Proverbs 8, the original story of Job, and here in the Hymn to Wisdom. Finally, the Hymn to Wisdom ends with a line of text that's regarded as a possible interpolation. It seems to have been added to the poem in order to link it with the narrative of Job. It states that the fear of Yahweh is wisdom, and avoiding evil is understanding. Since understanding God is beyond human capacity, even if you work at it like a miner digging deep into the earth, it's best to just fear Him and concentrate on being a good person, and quit trying to guess His motives. Sometime later, the prologue and epilogue were added. These two sections bookend the story, but it's unlikely they were written by the same person. There are some inconsistencies when they're examined, which we'll get into shortly. The prologue is presented in the first two chapters of Job and essentially hijacks the entire narrative. Where once God was inscrutable, the entire point of the book, now God is suddenly engaged in a debate with one of his employees, and the narrative of Job is now reduced to a simple test to determine if Job is faithful to God. This section doesn't fit the monologues for a variety of reasons, as we'll soon see, nor does it exactly fit the epilogue. So in the beginning of chapter 1, we're told that Job is blameless and upright. So instantly it's confirmed that Job has done nothing wrong, something we already knew. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-donkeys. Also, Job lives in Edom, not Israel. Another detail of note is that he would offer sacrifices and sanctify his sons after their feasts, which might have meant that they partied a bit too hard. But Job is offering sacrifices himself, and there's no indication anyone sees any problem with this. This means he's not subject to the notion of centralized worship in Jerusalem. We then switch to a scene in heaven when the sons of El presented themselves before Yahweh, and a Satan joined them. So we have a heavenly council presided over by Yahweh, and it includes the sons of El Elyon, of which there were 70. Then a Satan arrives to inform them that he'd been doing his job, which included patrolling the earth. At this, Yahweh asks if the Satan had noticed Job. Of course he had, and he believes that Job's piety is merely the result of the many blessings bestowed upon him by Yahweh. If they worked against him, Job would show his true colors and curse Yahweh to his face. So Yahweh gives the Satan permission to attack Job's property and family. Back on Earth, a messenger arrives at Job's house to tell him the Sabaeans, inhabitants of Sheba, a region in southern Arabia, had carried off his oxen and donkeys and killed all of his servants, with the exception of the man delivering this message. Then another servant popped up to tell him fire from heaven had killed all of his sheep and the servants who were tending them, except, of course, for this one guy who escaped to deliver the message. Perhaps they were sodomite sheep, and that's why the fire killed them. A third servant arrives and tells him the Chaldeans carried off all his camels and put the camel servants to the sword, except, of course, for the one who got away. And this mention of the Chaldeans points to an exilic period for this story, or perhaps later. Finally, a fourth servant runs up to inform Job that a great wind assailed the house where his children were feasting, and, surprise, everyone died except for the one servant. Note to self, if you're ever in the presence of Job's servants, run. We're then told that Job didn't sin, nor did he blame God in any way after these calamities struck. This is a major deviation from the monologues where he blames God incessantly. Also, in the monologues, Job's children are still alive. Another oddity is that the sheep are killed by fire, yet in the monologues, it's his house that was destroyed in that manner. I'd also like to point out the pattern here. Calamities 1 and 3 are caused by human raiders, while 2 and 4 are caused by divine smiting. Chapter 2 begins with a repeat of the intro of Chapter 1, and I mean it's verbatim. One day the sons of El presented themselves to Yahweh, and the Satan was with them. Yahweh asked the Satan where he had been, and he replied that he'd been patrolling the earth. Yahweh then asked if he'd noticed his blameless servant Job. After this, the Satan suggests causing harm to Job's flesh and bones. If he did that, then Job would surely curse Yahweh to his face. Yahweh agrees to the Satan's plan, but stipulates that he can't end Job's life, just as he had stipulated in the previous meeting that the Satan couldn't assault Job's body directly. So the Satan departed Yahweh's company and afflicted Job with boils over his entire body. The man then took to sitting in ashes, and his wife told him he should curse God, which would provoke God into killing him. That way he could just die and stop suffering. Such a supportive wife. But Job responded that they accepted the good things God had given them, so should he not also accept the evil? And again, Job did not sin. And this idea that evil comes from Yahweh can be found in Isaiah 45:7. The idea of evil personified hasn't entered their theology yet. The Satans are just divine messengers who work for Yahweh to do jobs against humans. At the end of chapter 2, we're told that 3 of Job's friends went over to him when they learned of his troubles: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. But they didn't immediately recognize Job because of his sorry state, so they sat with him and mourned him for 7 days. A few things to note here. This is the last we see of the Satan. He's never again mentioned anywhere in the book outside of the first 2 chapters. Another detail of note is that we're specifically told at the end of chapter 2 that none of Job's friends ever spoke. This is odd because half of the book is filled with their words. There are a couple of interesting explanations for this. One is that the prologue was part of a story that was written before the monologues were written. In this case, the end of the story would be the epilogue that we will touch on in a moment, and the middle of the story would have been deleted and replaced with the extensive monologues. Another possibility is that the names of the 3 friends were changed to coincide with the names of Job's opponents from the monologues. Without knowing which came first, the prologue or the monologues, there's no way to really tell. We also have to mention that the tragedies seem to have come from God himself. It was God, not a Satan, who dropped fire and sent devastating winds to destroy Job's property. And Job acknowledges that it was God who caused the evils that affected his body. So the idea of a Satan angel may be a later addition to the prologue, especially when we consider that the epilogue contains no mention of the Satan admitting to Yahweh that Job was indeed as pious as he had seemed. The epilogue begins in chapter 42, verse 7, and finishes out the chapter. In this scene, Yahweh himself rewards Job for his piety by restoring all that was lost. But before that, he rages against Job's friends for speaking wrongly about God. This conflicts with what we read in the prologue, which tells us they never spoke at all. But here, Job is clearly vindicated, if we're not sure exactly how. God doesn't elaborate on what exactly Eliphaz and the others said that was so wrong concerning the nature of God and his actions. He instructs them to take 7 bulls and 7 rams and sacrifice them. Then they must beg Job to pray to God on their behalf, so Job becomes an intermediary for his friends who pretended at wisdom. When that is done, God shows favor and chooses not to punish Job's friends. The brothers and sisters of Job consoled him for all the evil that God had wrought, and bestowed him with money. Then God blessed Job with 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she-donkeys, exactly double what had been taken from him. This comes from Exodus 22:3, which states that the fine for inflicting damage to someone's property is to repay them double its value. So God is here holding himself accountable for his crimes, the exact opposite of what happens at the end of the traditional story. God also gives him 7 replacement sons and 3 replacement daughters, because if you give someone new kids, then it's sort of okay that you killed the other ones, right? The daughters were also given an inheritance, which wasn't typical unless there were no male heirs. That totally makes up for the killing of the original 10 kids. Finally, we're told that Job lived 140 years, 20 years longer than the 120-year limit that Yahweh had imposed on humanity following the Great Flood that so many others also exceeded. And that's the end of the epilogue. There are a few notable details to cover. Where's the Satan from the prologue? Why isn't there a scene in which he acknowledges to God that Job was indeed a righteous man? The end of the prologue states that Job's 3 friends never spoke, yet here in the epilogue, God is angry with them for speaking untrue words about the deity. Also, God is responsible for the evils which befell Job, yet in the prologue, that was the work of the Satan angel. Also, Job being rewarded for his piety undoes the entire point of the main narrative, the idea that God is unknowable. Here in the epilogue, it was all just a test. Job is rewarded for being good, and all is now right with the world. With this in mind, we must consider the possibility that the prologue and epilogue, minus those brief mentions of the Satan, are actually older than the monologues, as they express a more primitive concept of God. God tests his followers, and he rewards the faithful while punishing the wicked. But in the monologues, contained in the middle chapters, God's ways are unknowable, and the idea that everyone gets what they deserve while still on earth is being left behind in favor of the inscrutable God and his mysterious actions. The final section to consider comes in chapters 32 to 37, which contains the speeches of Elihu. Who is Elihu, you might ask? Well, that's a good question. Well, really, we don't have an answer. He just randomly appears in chapter 32, which follows Job's final speech. Elihu spouts a lot of empty words and then vanishes again, never to be mentioned by anyone in any layer of the text. The prologue, epilogue, and the main body of the text all reference 3 friends speaking with Job. Even God himself doesn't know of this additional individual, and he knows everything. Just read chapters 38 to 42 for a list of all the things that God knows. Essentially, some later scribe decided he could do a better argument than the 3 friends. He not only has a better argument, he has the best words. He's even inspired by God himself. He literally says these things. But despite his claims, The Elihu section adds nothing to the story and serves only to spoil the plot. Elihu pops up, completely unannounced, and is angry at the three friends for not finding a compelling argument to use against Job. He believed that older people would speak wisdom, but it's the Spirit that gives understanding, and Elihu has the Spirit. If Job had spoken with Elihu, he would have met with a stronger argument and would have been convinced. Elihu says that he is full of words, the best words, and the Spirit compels him. He's so sure of himself and his words that he spends the entirety of chapter 32 telling us not his arguments, but about the strength of his words. In the next chapter, Elihu gets to his actual argument, which isn't that much different from the arguments that Job already found unconvincing. Here, they're just stated less eloquently. Elihu begins by telling Job that he may claim innocence, but God counts him as an enemy, which doesn't actually argue against Job, as this is exactly what Job has been saying all along, that God sees Job as an enemy despite his apparent innocence. Elihu then goes on to suggest Job is prideful, and God is punishing him to prevent such pride, which will keep Job from the pit. He then agrees with Job by stating that if a divine mediator existed, then Job would be restored, and God would favor him. Not exactly the best argument when you agree with your opponent. But the idea of a heavenly mediator does suggest Persian influence, as they were the inventors of the guardian angels who served just this role, and this idea became popular in Judaism under the Persian influence. It's possible that the redactor who added the Satan verses to the prologue also added the Elihu speeches. Elihu assumes Job's guilt and even suggests God should have punished Job even more. Job should have received death, but was actually spared by God at the last moment, so he only suffered terrible afflictions instead. We do see something interesting in chapter 33. Elihu seems to suggest that descending into the pit would be a great punishment for Job, far worse than his current life. Though, in the earlier monologues, Job longs for Sheol as an escape. This seems to indicate that Sheol and the pit are distinct destinations. One is a dim shadow of life, while the other is a place of terrible torment. I think that what we're seeing here is a reference to the burning pit in the desert that we saw in 1st Enoch, the place where the wicked and the evil watchers were cast to be tortured by angels of torment who were sent by Yahweh. Another interesting note comes from the beginning of chapter 34. It begins by stating, Elihu answered, but there's nothing from Job for him to be answering. This suggests that the redactor who added the Elihu material also inserted a response from Job, to which Elihu then replied. Elihu accuses Job of blasphemy for declaring his innocence despite his obvious guilt. Surely he's guilty of something if he's being punished for it. The same tired argument we've heard from all three friends in previous chapters. Elihu begins quoting God from the subsequent chapters by asking rhetorical questions like, who set the world in its place? He also claims God controls the floods and the clouds. God is obviously in control of the world, and only a just God can do that. So obviously God can't be unjust in his punishment of Job. Job needs to realize this and return to God before it's too late. Chapter 35 also begins by stating that Elihu was again answering Job, so again we have evidence that more of the text is missing. He then goes on to say that the actions of Job don't affect God, only other people. This wouldn't really be the case if God could potentially lose a bet with one of his angels concerning Job's behavior. God answers the righteous but ignores the wicked, and since Job didn't understand this, God is now punishing him. He then begins speaking on God's behalf in chapter 36, and according to Elihu's own words, he is perfect in knowledge. How can we argue with that? He tells us that God places the just on thrones and exalts them forever. The astute listener will know that I'm about to tell you to remember this detail for later because of its importance. Elihu then claims that if anyone is being afflicted, God will tell them what they've done to deserve such a punishment. This is literally all that Job has been asking for since the very beginning, yet he still lacks an answer. You'd think that one who is perfect in knowledge, such as Elihu, could give it. The wicked die young, and the righteous are rewarded with prosperity. Elihu then tells us of the thundering that comes from God's tent. He holds the lightning in his hands. Thunder announces him, and he incites a fury of thunderstorms. Many more indications that Yahweh is a storm god. And because of God's greatness, he can judge nations. In the final chapter of this section, Elihu begins by telling us of God's thundering voice. His thunder goes everywhere, and his light reaches to the edges of the world. And God does great things beyond our understanding, like telling the snow and the rain to fall, and releasing tempests from their chambers where they are kept. All of these details are taken from the last chapters of the book, where God outlines his own greatness. So Elihu is just borrowing from later chapters. Finally, at the end of the Elihu section, Elihu tells Job that the splendor of God comes from Mount Zaphon. This is the holy mountain outside the Canaanite city of Ugarit, upon which the storm god Baal-Hadad lives. The residents of Judah would later name one of their own mountains by this, a mountain near Jerusalem. Oh, and one last thing. The last line of Elihu's speech states that no one can see God, which is perfect because of where this chapter has been inserted. The very first line of the next chapter, chapter 38, is when Yahweh suddenly appears in person to Job. And that's it. That's the end of the story of Job and all the little bits that were tacked on in later decades and centuries. Elihu attempts to state Yahweh's case for him by implying that God is so great and majestic that humans simply can't comprehend him, mainly by borrowing from chapters 38 to 41. And perhaps that is what is meant when Elihu states he speaks on God's behalf. He's literally just taking God's own words from him. And Elihu's argument for the inscrutable nature of God comes on the heels of his argument for the perfectly understandable nature of God, in which he merely punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous, using lines he took from the first three speakers. But what of all those tidbits I've been telling you to set aside for future reference? Reading Job was tedious. 39 chapters of rap battles concerning the nature of God and morality, and whether or not a miserable man deserves his rash. It was one of my least favorite books we've covered so far on the podcast, and that includes the book of Numbers. But like those miners in the Hymn to Wisdom digging in the darkness beneath the mountains, I found precious little gems that made the task worthwhile. I may not have uncovered true wisdom, but the treasure I did find was quite rewarding, and it makes me glad I took this dive into Job despite the tedium. So here goes. The story of Job is important, not for what it contains, but for what it is missing. Specifically, what the text itself begs for, the ideas that the authors wished for, that they felt were missing from their still evolving theology. Just take a look at those sections I asked you to remember. Job longs for a mediator in heaven, one who can speak on his behalf and offer him a fair trial in the face of the Creator of the universe. Job 16:19, and in Job 19:25, he claims that his Redeemer lives. The very next verse, we see Job's flesh being stripped away as he is transformed in the presence of God, a scene familiar to those who listen to my Enoch episodes. And just 2 verses later, we have a warning against judging other people, for doing so can invite judgment upon yourself. The righteous and the wicked all suffer the same fate, a dim existence in Sheol, But it's clear in chapter 21, verse 20, that the pious and the wicked should find themselves in separate versions of the afterlife, another idea found in Enoch. Chapter 36, verse 7 tells us how the righteous are enthroned as kings and exalted forever. Job also longs for the righteous to wake after the sleep of death in chapter 14, an idea found in the letters of Paul. But perhaps the most important passage comes from chapter 31, verses 34 to 40, where we learn that Job desires to stand in a heavenly courtroom before a divine judge where he can face his accuser as a prince and not a criminal. And while the land cries out against him, he can present his signature as the symbol of his innocence. But not just his signature, his mark, the Tav, a Hebrew letter that was written as a cross. Job serves as a mouthpiece for those who feel discontent with Jewish theology and the perceived injustice they experience. There's a tangible longing for reform, for a better model, for justice, which they know will not occur within their own lifetime, but perhaps after they die. The prologue and epilogue attempt to address this problem, but ultimately they fail to do so. By reducing Job's plight, and thereby reducing the plight of the Jewish people to a mere test, the people would hardly feel placated, but instead patronized. Job wants a heavenly arbiter and actual justice which affects those who deserve it, not some later generations. He wants to be rewarded for his piety, not punished for God's indifference. Because of this simple notion, the idea of a heavenly courtroom, where humans can plead their case and a divine intermediator stands neutral, listening and weighing their deeds to determine innocence or guilt, is the inspiration for the Son of Man figure who will later become the Christ. We have here in Job the kernel of Christianity centuries before the religion existed. The authors reveal their displeasure with Jewish theology and its perceived cosmic injustice. If a righteous man suffers, as many do, and there is no afterlife where such injustice can be corrected, and their God is seemingly indifferent to their plight because of his inscrutable nature, then there's no point in living a righteous life. But all of those things can be corrected with a new theology, and the words of Job beg for such a change. An afterlife where they remain connected with God instead of separated from Him as they are in Sheol. A chance to wake again like a tree cut down that sprouts anew. A chance to plead their case before a divine mediator, and a reward for their faithfulness. Essentially, Job is complaining that Christianity doesn't yet exist. And as this work is an expression of a common thought, we must remember that a longing for an idea can only exist for so long before that idea arises. It's human nature to invent the things for which they desire, and here we see that there were Jews who clearly desired a reform to their religion. And who better to symbolize that idea than another pious and suffering servant? That's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can also be found on that same post on Facebook. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsandgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsandgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your questions in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsandgenesispodcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site at dragonsandgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.